You're listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
You're listening to the NASP Podcast. This specialty pharmacy podcast is a collaboration with the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy and the Pharmacy Podcast Network. The mission of the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy is to improve specialty pharmacy practice by promoting continuing professional education and certification of specialty pharmacists while advocating for public policies that ensure patient access to specialty medications. As the healthcare industry's leading podcast dedicated to the pharmacy profession, the Pharmacy Podcast Network is proud to bring our listeners the NASP Podcast, in collaboration with the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy.
Hello, my name is Sheila Arquette, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy. I am delighted to welcome a very special guest, Stuart Kamin, to this episode of the NASP Podcast. Stuart is a healthcare analytics specialist. As SVP of Analytics and Innovation, he manages the strategic direction and deployment of the Claritas Rx technical platform to support launches for innovative specialty medicines. He built his expertise in specialty channel data through his previous work in lifecycle pricing and contract strategy at Genentech and in global consulting with IMS Health. Stuart holds dual MBA and MPH degrees from UC Berkeley and a BS in psychobiology from UCLA. Stuart, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here, Sheila.
So let's just jump right in. So Stuart, let's talk a little bit about this evolution of personalized medicine and the impact that it's had on market and patient access teams, right? Their ability to catch up. How has that been an opportunity for Claritas Rx to use AI and machine learning to assist these folks?
Well, that is a big question, Sheila. Thank you for asking it. When I think about this, I like to come back to the beginning of that question, which is to look at the evolution of personalized medicine. So a few decades ago, it was commonplace to have broadband, small molecule, retail-based therapy pills, essentially, for millions of patients. And everybody accepted that there would be this bell curve of response. Some patients would do pretty well. Many patients would do okay, and some patients wouldn't do very well. And as we come into the 21st century and the genome has been sequenced and significant developments have occurred around protein synthesis and development, we've seen the advent of autologous cell therapy and gene therapy come into the fold. We've watched clinical practice become more and more and more precision, and in some cases, truly personalized. And so 10 or 15 years ago, teams of biopharmaceutical manufacturers and partners like specialty pharmacies and other patient support partners would think about patient populations of several tens of thousands of patients who might need a monoclonal antibody for an inflammatory condition or oncolytics for particular types of cancers. And we've continued to watch that journey of personalization progress to the point where now it is truly best practice to be sequencing patients' genomes, to be taking labs, to be developing a targeted approach for them, where eligible patient populations may now be 5,000 people instead of 50,000 or 5 million people. And as the patient populations for these different therapies have grown more and more and more targeted, life sciences companies have needed to support each patient with more and more and more services to make sure that those patients have exactly the right experience on their medicine. Now, for us at Claritas Rx, we see an opportunity there to support that broader mission of enabling the patient to have the best experience by using data and by using analytics and by using increasingly AI. Because it's one thing to say, well, of course I want a patient to have the best experience. I'm going to hire a hub. I'm going to deploy patient services. I'm going to have a limited distribution of specialty pharmacies. They're all going to be experts in their field. I'm going to bring on a copay affordability solution and a digital patient engagement solution. And I'm going to have a field team of access professionals and nurses who are all going to help the practice understand how to navigate the prior authorization landscape. That's a lot of moving pieces now that have to be coordinated around every single patient. And not every patient needs the same combination of all of those services. And so our belief is that patient services is like anything else. You can approach it in a data-driven way, in a scientific way, measure what works, and use information to better guide the deployment of these services so that patients can truly get the best experience from their medicine. That's where we come in. So I'm happy to talk more about sort of what we're seeing around the use of technology, machine learning, and AI in this space, but it does ultimately come from this evolution of medicine itself towards a more personalized approach.
Right. And as you're talking through that, Stuart, I am kind of thinking about everything that we learned, right, when we went down this road of population health, right, based like that type of management approach. And so now, as you're talking, I'm thinking, everything that we learned, we don't have to kind of toss aside, but now the definition of population has changed, right? Like where you said used to be, large numbers of patients. Now a population could be like 100 patients, perhaps.
That's right. And in fact, each one of those patients now has 100 times or 10,000 times as much data associated with them as every patient did 30 years ago in the broadband scenario. And of course, that information is sensitive. There are important privacy considerations to be very mindful of when working with that data, but it also creates an opportunity to truly understand the patient experience in a way that just wasn't possible 20 years ago.
Right. And as you better understand, like you had kind of talked in the beginning about, right, there was that, that subset of patients that didn't respond to what we did in the past. So now, as you know more about them as an individual and their individual needs and their responses to therapy, is it possible now to switch to make sure that they do have a positive income, right? You're able to make those changes and pivot when necessary so that there isn't a treatment failure.
That's exactly right. And not only is there that opportunity from a clinical perspective to understand the patient's genetic makeup, to configure their treatment protocol to be aligned with best practices for their genotype, their subphenotype, but you can do the same thing on the commercial and patient services side as well. You can look at the degree to which a patient is responding to pharmacy programs or responding to a cadence of phone calls or responding to a digital patient engagement app or the content that is served to them. And by measuring, ideally in a sort of robust, controlled way, the patient's engagement with all of those various methods of outreach, you can tune those various levers and optimize them and watch as a patient's experience gets better. So you don't even need to wait for the patient to have a negative reaction to a services approach. You can constantly optimize and reconfigure what they're getting in real time to really do the best by every patient in a personalized way.
All right, so let's talk more about that. So how does Claritas use, right, AI and machine learning to positively, impact that journey, right, and that outcome?
It starts with data and pulling data together, because just the same way that the patient journey is a perhaps nonlinear but continuous and longitudinal process, we need to pull together many different types of data in order to mirror that longitudinal journey. So it's working with specialty pharmacies and patient call centers and copay card solutions and digital patient engagement apps and field access teams. It's all of the various services that are wrapped around the patient produce information. Connecting all of that at a patient level in a compliant way, cleansing the data, shaping it, is a big part of creating something that can be fed into machine learning models, AI models. So that's the first step. And we have some just delightful stories of where we have done that for programs where we're consuming tens of thousands of data elements about every single patient every 15 minutes from the whole ecosystem of partners, and then using that to drive real-time visibility into what the patient is going through. So once we have all that data pulled together, then the question is, well, how do we not only understand where the patient is and what barriers are they running into now? That's certainly the first step. But also, can we predict what barriers the patient will run into in the near future?
We're not just talking about clinical barriers, right, Stuart? We're talking about anything that could impact the patient's ability to be compliant and adherent, take their medication on time, manage side effects, right? It's not just the medication itself.
That's absolutely right. And for us, it starts even upstream of compliance and persistency. We, in the data, see a lot of patients who are prescribed these therapies who never even start. They don't start because their practice runs into complexity around prior authorizations, or they don't start because they don't realize that they have access to a commercial affordability solution, or they don't start because somebody keeps trying to call their cell phone and they see an 800 number come up and they don't know who it is, so they don't answer it. So there's lots of reasons why patients never even start therapies that their physicians prescribe to them. And so that's an important piece of where we can not only detect what's happening in the moment, but predict where those barriers will show up that might even prevent them from starting in the first place. And then, to your point, we want them to stay on treatment as long as is appropriate. And so we can also forecast at a patient level which patients are likely to run into challenges that may disproportionately cause them to drop off of therapy prematurely. And, sometimes these events are pretty obvious. If you have a prior authorization that's denied, that creates complexity. If you have a very high copay, that creates complexity for you as a patient. But sometimes the risks for patients initiating treatment and persisting are actually a confluence of lots of little factors that in and of themselves wouldn't be a cause for concern. But when you put them all together, they create this confluence, this headwind that does create material risk for the patient. And it's that web of weak barriers that are creating hardship for patients where machine learning and AI can be a great tool for figuring that out before they combine and cause a patient to stop their journey.
Right, so I could see tremendous utility here for physicians, right, or prescribers as well, especially those in shared risk arrangements, right? If you could bring back some of this information and say, for this type of, diagnosis, or perhaps a patient with, these like confounding variables, right? This is the information that you need to know. right? Right from the get-go, right? When you're selecting a drug or you're talking to them about their therapy or you're putting together a treatment plan, I would think that this would be incredibly helpful.
I think that that's really astute, Sheila. It's funny. It's something we probably don't talk about as much as we could, but the experience of the physician and the practice is really correlated with the outcome of the patient. And that's intuitive at some level because many times a practice is the patient's gateway into the healthcare system, but you see it in the numbers all the time. A physician that is more experienced with a brand, that understands the brand's clinical profile, understands the support services that are available for the brand, that doctor's patients are going to be more likely to initiate therapy and stay on as appropriate. A physician that maybe hasn't figured out as much how to incorporate that therapy into their practice, right, even if it's right for the next patient, that second physician's patients are going to be less likely to start treatment and persist, even if their coverage and affordability is relatively decent. And so, distilling the risk factors here, things like physician experience that can influence the propensity of a patient to have a good experience is really helpful to your point because it's actionable. You can enable, whether it's a life sciences company or a health system that's taking risk, to educate the right clinical stakeholders, practice management stakeholders. You can see patients that are likely to be at risk much earlier in the process. And basically what we do is, in order to do that, is create what folks have called digital phenotypes. So we see from all this data that we're integrating, this next patient looks a lot like many other patients that we've seen before. And that allows us to mine through various scenarios that might impact the patient in different ways and recommend on a faster clip what the manufacturer and their partners and others in the stakeholder ecosystem might best do to support the patient.
So tell me more about that, Stuart. How do you tailor, right, the predictive capabilities of AI or machine learning to service the unique needs of patients in these patient access teams who are trying best to support them?
I think the first thing we do when we're working with a life sciences company to deploy AI to help their patients is listen. We really appreciate the opportunity to co-create with our life sciences partners, with others in the ecosystem, because AI that predicts what's going to happen with patients is great. It's best if it's actually used. It doesn't do any good to have AI predictions or recommendations that case management teams aren't using as a general practice. So the first thing that I think is important is to understand where those teams are coming from, what their objectives are, what their service portfolios look like, their policy landscape looks like, and then figure out, okay, well, what is the right combination of models to be deploying? We have a library of different models that will predict endpoints from prescription abandonment and free drug conversion to prior authorization denial, premature discontinuation. So a piece of it is understanding what are the objectives, what models are helpful, and then we tune the models. There are ways of really sort of tweaking levers in these machine learning pipelines so that you can say, hey, I want this model to be super precise. When it says there's a patient that is at risk, I want there to be a very high likelihood that that's actually true. And so if you say to a case manager, hey, I think that this patient's at very high risk and the precision on my model is very high, that case manager has a lot of confidence that they're talking to a patient who really needs help. And conversely, other teams might say, well, I like the precision when there's a lot of risk, but I also want a surveillance net. I want a safety net that is going to detect all the patients that might be at some risk for, let's say, premature drop-off, lack of adherence. So we say, okay, we can tune the model a different way and then characterize all of the patients that are at some risk by solving for what they call recall, finding all of the patients at risk. And we put these different techniques together and can sub-segment the patient population in such a way that these case manager teams understand what they're looking at, and they feel compelled to take action when they see an alert that's driven by these AI systems. And the stories that come back to us about, places where a patient would have fallen through the cracks had it not been for something like this are pretty amazing.
So Stuart, as you're talking, I'm envisioning, right, future state, there being like some type of either computer program or an app where, before a medication is even prescribed, you could, enter into, this is Stuart, and these are, this is what's going on with Stuart. Help me develop a treatment plan for Stuart that's going to work. Right. Well, where are the, the landmines that I have to navigate around? Right. And what potential issues could we have? And how do I get Stuart from point A to point B in the straightest possible line?
I love that vision.
Yeah.
And, it's funny just thinking about that as you talk about it in that way. I do think there's a fair amount of planning that practices try to do around what is the best treatment for a patient, particularly where there are multiple options. But of course, they only have the information that they have.
Right.
There's a lot of information floating out there that often is not present at the point of care or the point of decision making about a patient's social determinants of health,
right,
or their coverage policy, or their the journey of patients that have looked like them in the past. And so I think there's utility in these techniques for physicians, for health plans, for manufacturers. And I think it's interesting. I think you are starting to see the adoption of AI by these different groups. You see physician groups adopting AI to go work through prior authorizations, for example, in a more efficient and effective way. You see the adoption of AI by the payer community to better stratify risk. And you see the adoption of AI by a lot of the sort of commercial leaning folks on the manufacturing side to go figure out which patients are likely to be eligible for a new prescription. Where I think we see an opportunity, where this technology isn't being leveraged nearly as much, is actually once that prescription is written on the manufacturing side, to help those teams better figure out how to take care of patients that are, clinically appropriate for therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about these models. How accurate are they?
They're pretty accurate. And I will say, just to sort of take a step back, there's a lot I think that can be done without AI, just in getting the data together and doing this reporting and structuring the inside of the patient experience. All of that is really valuable for teams on the ground. But once folks have, crawled and then walked and they're ready to run, this can be a great way to begin that process. We routinely see that when we're deploying these models, they'll correctly predict for high risk groups 80% of patients that are likely to experience a negative event. And when we're configuring that surveillance safety net, we're seeing again and again the detection of more than 80% of possible cases out there. So there is a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of sort of empirical support for the use of machine learning in patient services.
So let's say we start with a patient, new patient to therapy, right? We put them into one of these models or into these groups. Then do you take that patient's individual response and also then use it, right, to further drill down for that particular person, right? Like future actions or what we could anticipate with this one patient, right? Because I always tell people patients do what they do, right? Being a practicing pharmacist from a long time ago, I was always surprised at some of the stuff that people would do, right? Despite you trying to counsel them and you're trying to cover everything that you can, right? Cover all your bases, but still sometimes they just do what they do. So can you take some of those behaviors, right? Or those actions and then use that then to further tailor your approach, these life sciences, patient access teams, to further tailor the approach for that person?
Absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the frontier is on this. And recommendation engines will, when sort of like properly built and configured, will say, well, hey, this type of patient tends to prefer to get a text in the evening with this sort of content. And, when they click on the link, they prefer to go to this sort of view and to see their benefits. That's what they like. It's this other segment actually would rather get a phone call or maybe even have the doctor's office call them. They respond to telephone better. I mean, we all know folks in our lives who you try to send them an email that's complicated, but you send them a text to get right back to you. Well, I mean, patients are just people, right? So to your point, the same sorts of techniques can be used to optimize the outreach to those patients. The question is, at some level, are we getting the data necessary to drive these models and to optimize outreach? And so you sort of come back to thinking carefully about, in order to set the system up that really personalizes patient support for each individual, it pays to be thoughtful about how information's being collected, how it's being pulled together, what is the framework with which the patient journey is being looked at, and who on the care team is being pulled into that. Because the other thing that I think we often see is, just the same way that some patients prefer a text and some patients prefer a phone call, sometimes where a patient is in the journey can be perfectly well supported by the hub or patient call center. Sometimes you really need the specialty pharmacy to be the one to reach out. And knowing the difference, even for the same patient, can make it and it can have an impact on the likelihood of them getting on and staying on therapy as appropriate. And so it does require a continuous feedback loop, a continuous management of information about the patient as quickly as possible, a sort of robust patient framework to look at what are they likely to run into next, and who's the best stakeholder on the care team to intervene, who's best positioned to make a difference.
Right. And like you said, that can change for the same patient on the same journey, right? But they're just at a different point in the journey. If everything's going okay, hey, maybe it's fine. We can communicate via text. Oh, geez, I went to the doctor and I have cancer and I'm progressing. I want to talk to somebody, right? I need some reassurance, or what are we going to do? I want to talk to somebody. So we have to be flexible enough, right, to pivot to meet their needs.
That's absolutely right. And I think that sort of flexibility and the productive communication across the care team is really sort of important in order to serve the patient well. And in fact, when we see these sorts of AI and machine learning techniques be most impactful, again, they're not used in a vacuum. They're just another tool in the toolkit that teams can use to focus their efforts. Many times it stimulates a dialogue between a hub and an SP, or an SP and a practice, that otherwise might not have occurred. And it's often that dialogue that is what is the real intervention point, that really sort of like is the moment where the patient journey changes.
Yeah.
And, if nothing else, hopefully a lot of this sort of machine learning and AI work in patient services helps us create more of the right conversations between the right folks at the right time.
All right. So explain to me how we collect this data, right? And you keep saying machine learning and AI. What's the difference, right? I'm assuming that we take the data and we do something with it, and then that's into the machine who's learning, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So machine learning is just one type of AI. I think one way that we like to think about things is you sort of have AI broadly, which is about having computer systems, synthetic systems, facilitate decision making, or recommendations, or do things that we associate with people, with the way our minds work. Now, there's no computer system today that works the way our minds work. There are many scholars who doubt that will ever happen. If it does, it's far in the future. So today, when we talk about AI, when anybody talks about AI, they're generally talking about one of a few different buckets of capabilities. I think a lot of what people see in the press today, and what we're sort of constantly surrounded with, is generative AI. So if you have sort of the chat GPTs of the world, mining through big libraries of text and video and other content and producing something novel. Now, that has many use cases. It's not as measurable as some other use cases for AI, and it doesn't really sort of predict the future. It's used to create something new. If you want to predict an outcome, then what a lot of people will look to is another subset of AI that folks call machine learning, because it is, as you alluded to, methods for helping computers learn. And without getting into too many of the gory details, basically what a lot of these models do is they create a proxy for a neural net. There are many different nodes of information, and the nodes of information look at many different scenarios of possibility and the likelihood of those possibilities, and solve for the possibilities that have the least amount of error, if you will, and then generate an output based on that solution. And then you can measure that, right? Because if I put all this information through a neural net and it predicts that a patient will discontinue in the next 90 days, well, that event is either going to happen or it's not going to happen. And so we can measure the accuracy of these machine learning models. And that's how we're able to say, oh yeah, we have models that are 80% precise or more, for example.
So are there any compliance concerns with working with all of this data, right? And running it through all these different algorithms or machinations?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's patient level data. So we have to be really mindful and compliant with HIPAA, high tech. We at Claritas Rx have a HIPAA high tech, SOC 2, and now GDPR compliant platform. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about where we're getting data from, how we're combining it with other sets of data, what we're producing, how that information that's being produced is being used in support of patients. So I do think that this goes hand in hand with conversations about de-identification and patient consent and the management of privacy considerations. A great example of this is, one thing that we like to do to really tune our models is mine through free text. Many times the data we get, the sort of structured data we get is really helpful. But if we can mine through pharmacy notes or hub notes, that can tell us a lot about for example, the emotional state of a patient over time. And that can correlate with their outcomes too. Well, forget about the sort of all the technical complexity around mining free text. There's privacy complexity around doing that because it's PHI. I mean, or PII, if the patient's consented, you might have lots of information about who that patient is in that text. And so managing that appropriately is a foundational part of making this work well. And that is maybe one reason why this is a bit of a different space than using AI for a video game, for example, because you have to be really careful about protecting patients' privacy in the course of doing this work.
Absolutely. And you had said earlier, right, that a computer doesn't think the way that the human mind does. So this mining seems to be interesting, right? Trying to get more than just objective data, but there may be subjective or some emotional, right? Some insights that could be used.
Yeah, it is really, it's fascinating. I've been really impressed by our data science team as they've sort of creatively looked at ways to use methods of mining free text and then translating that into metrics that can be used to measure a patient's emotional state. I mean, to your point, a computer is not going to understand what it is for a patient to feel hopeless or in need of support or sort of questioning where they are on their journey. And there's been a lot of really good literature written about the importance of social emotional support for patients, particularly with going through, complex treatment journeys. But by that same token, if we can translate that emotional state into data that can be fed into these AI models, then we can take better care of those patients maybe because we can detect when patients are going through that emotional roller coaster and configure our outreach to them more effectively. We can have a better understanding of their likelihood to run into particular types of problems. So while it may be a little counterintuitive, there's actually a lot of value in appropriately mining text and using it to better understand the needs of each patient.
It's just fascinating. Stuart, are there other opportunities, right, to enhance these models or the predictions that they're making that folks who are listening may not be as familiar with?
Sure, there are a lot, and I'll give you a couple sort of that have to do with data, but then I think there's sort of a broader call to action. So a couple that are interesting, we're doing a lot of work right now around social context. There's been a lot that's been written about social determinants of health and how that can correlate with the patient's outcomes. Separately, I think, a lot of the conversation we've had about the experience of the doctor predicting the outcome of the patient, well, that's true of a physician's experience on a particular therapy. What if that were also true of the physician's experience across a class, right? Across many similar types of therapy? The data on that has been harder to get at, but we've done some work in the last few years to create data sets that supplement more traditional market level data so we can understand, how a particular prescriber, for example, has behaved across different specialty therapies. So I think there's some interesting opportunity to be leveraging that, look sort of beyond the brand, if you will, at the broader market. But ultimately, I think the biggest opportunity for a lot of this is for market access and patient services teams and their partners to look at this as a very practical tool. And by this, I mean machine learning and artificial intelligence methods, advanced analytical methods. Look at this as a very practical tool that they can be bringing into their operations the way many other teams within and beyond the biopharma industry have. There's a real opportunity to help patients more by leveraging the technology that's right in front of us.
It's fascinating. So if I heard you correctly, we can look at the broader market, right, to predict how a patient may react or their compliance or adherence to one particular brand. Is that true?
That's a lot of where our current research is focused on, is sort of like, what are the other sources of data we could be pulling in here to make our models even more accurate? And then what else can we be doing with our partners to make them more accessible and help even more people sort of get the benefit of letting technology do the heavy lifting?
Any closing thoughts, Stuart?
Well, we started this conversation about the personalization of medicine from a clinical perspective. And we've talked a lot about the opportunity to leverage AI and types of AI like machine learning to personalize it from a support perspective. I think that it's an exciting time in the journey of medicine broadly, as we think about the movement from the old days of broad-based retail, small molecule therapies, through the monoclonal antibodies that have been launched over the last couple of decades, and the combinations of those targeted therapies in response to different patient subpopulations. And we think about the foray into cell and gene therapy, and even perhaps what's beyond that. One thing is really clear: clinically, medicine is becoming increasingly personalized.
Right.
So the exciting thing for me, and I think for lots of folks that we partner with, is the opportunity to match that degree of personalization when we're supporting patients, by really understanding that person, and not just on a human level, although that is certainly central and will remain central to the provision of care, but to assist the case manager, to assist the pharmacist, to assist the field access team member with better AI that can help them be the best version of themselves in the moment when caring for patients. And that takes a village. So I would invite everybody listening to the podcast to reach out if this is of interest, and explore ways that we can sort of co-create this future of AI-assisted patient services together.
Well, that's awesome. Yes. And I second that. Please reach out, right? It's only through working together, right? And being collaborative that we're going to continue to advance this and keep up, right? With the train that's already left the station.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, Stuart, thanks so much for chatting with me and sharing this incredibly fascinating information.
Anytime, Sheila. It's great to be talking with you as always.
As a reminder, NASP corporate members are invited to be my guest on one complimentary podcast per year. For more information about this or other NASP membership benefits and events, please feel free to reach out to membership at naspnet.org or visit our website at www.naspnet.org. Until next time, have a great day.